Let me now introduce tonight's speakers. Trevor Kavanagh, who was for many years political editor of The Sun, Catherine MacLeod, who was political editor of the Glasgow Herald, Alice Thomson, who's a columnist on The Times, and Patrick Wintour, currently diplomatic editor for The Guardian. They're all very senior journalists, and I've asked them to reflect on what journalism was like at the start of their careers, how it's changed during their lifetimes, and how that has changed the way the press reports on politics and the way politicians respond. Our theme tonight is the nexus between politics and the press. Always tense, but has it now become dysfunctional or unhealthy? They're going to talk for 5 minutes each at the start, and we'll then have a panel discussion between us before we open it up to Q&A. Abby Tanner is going to collect your questions. If you want to ask your question direct, we'll ask you to unmute, but if you want Abby to put your question, that's fine. And please be understanding, if your question isn't selected, we may not be able to answer them all. I promise the seminar will end at the latest by 7:15. So let me now invite Trevor to go first to talk about politics and the press, then and now. Trevor, over to you.
Good evening, everybody. Trevor Kavanagh from The Sun, and I am the dinosaur in the room tonight. The world of journalism that I entered 60 odd years ago is now extinct. Those are the days of local papers, regional newspapers, and I started my days on the Surrey Mirror, which is now then selling in 1960 something like 120,000 copies a week, now selling rather less, 2,384 copies a week. This might not sound like it has much to do with politics today, but it does, because local newspapers are the grassroots of democracy. And we have lost an enormous amount by the fact that nearly all of those newspapers are now freebie giveaways, small amounts of news, and many of them have actually closed. In the days when I started on the Surrey Mirror, it had a newsroom as big as The Sun today, and certainly as many sub-editors. We had district offices which were fully manned by photographers and reporters. And we were out covering all the aspects of local life. We would pedal for miles through fog to parish council meetings and take notes for hours of things about disputes about bridle paths and planning permission. We would cover district councils and cover the debate over what the rate setting should be, how much residents should pay for the privilege of having their council operate on their behalf. We would go to the local magistrates' court and the county court and see people actually receiving their justice, their trials, and their punishments. We would report on all of those and the quarter sessions, the major courts of the time. And this would all appear in the papers in detail every week, and people would pore over those details and they would know exactly what was going on from every nook and cranny of their environment, their local community. That is almost totally absent today, and we've lost a great deal as a result in terms of accountability, transparency, and indeed what I think is democracy. And this is something that I think is not necessarily the end of the day. There is scope for local newspaper reporting in our daily lives and in our political lives. And it should be rehabilitated if that's possible. As for my political career, that began in Australia, not in England, when I worked in Canberra back in the 1970s. And I came back to England and stopped working directly in politics, but moved into industrial relations. I was one of the strikes correspondents of the Winter of Discontent period. A very illuminating period for politics as well, and became political editor of The Sun in 1983, a job I held for 23 years. So that's my background, and I'm sure we'll go into a lot more detail about other matters, but that's me for the moment.
Thank you, Trevor, for kicking off. Catherine, you're next. Are you as much of a dinosaur as Trevor?
Well, I think I might be Trevor has said many of the things that I would like to talk about. When I started in journalism, it was then a popular profession and actually also regarded as a good, respected trade. And the people that became journalists or reporters were drawn from a much wider demographic than they are now. People left school, they were bright, they chose not to go to university. Some of them might not even have thought of going to university, but they went to join papers and sometimes went to journalism college, but many of them were very good journalists. And that was when I was in Scotland on the Herald and in the BBC. By the time I left, there was more people that had gone to university, but most of the people that I worked with then had not. When I joined the lobby in Parliament, most political editors had not been to university, and Trevor was one of them. And Joe Murphy, who recently retired from the Evening Standard, an excellent journalist, was the last. Now, many of the journalists, if not most of them, have degrees from Russell Group universities, including Oxford and Cambridge and UCL, and also many of them went to public school, so that a lot of them are drawn from a very narrow cohort. When I was a young journalist, local papers were very important. I didn't go by bike. I went by car to the back of Beyond in Aberdeenshire, I tell you, to cover stories from community councils and district councils and regional councils. And although I had gone to university, people that I worked with regarded being a journalist as a very good apprenticeship while getting paid. And it was a good entry point for many of them. And you have to think of Harold Evans, who started his working life in a weekly newspaper in Ashton under Lyme. Local papers gave many people a good grounding and was regarded as a trade elevator. In Scotland, journalism was heavily unionised. Salaries were higher than English journalism for a long time. When I was in the Herald, till very recently, it was a closed shop. And in 1983, when I was working for the Present Journal in Aberdeen, I earned the same as a news editor in The Guardian. Free newspapers were kept out of Scotland for longer than the South, and that certainly helped maintain wages. I think one of the biggest differences now is that we were really encouraged to get out of the office. We were encouraged to meet councillors. If you were in Scotland, we kind of grew up with half of the Scottish Labour Party and the Scottish Tory Party, when both of them had more MPs than they did now. So when I got to Parliament, I knew some of them very well. And often good local stories were followed by the nationals. Now it's exceptional if local stories are followed up. And as Trevor said, that is a great sort of indictment of our democratic accountability. People sort of sometimes sneer at reporters covering courts and councils and what their MPs did in Parliament. Some of them got sort of column inches about whether or not they had asked about the E66, but that was very important to let people understand what happened in their name across the board. And to this day, I think local papers are trusted more than nationals, and where they are still available, they are more closely read. When Jackie Weaver of Handworth Parish Council fame made the headlines, she would not have made the headlines had it not been for local papers. And she probably did shine more light on parish councils and politics at a local level as she did on the entertainment value of her having to behave with these men. Now, lots of these local papers are being closed or taken over by groups. Journalism has become a much more middle-class profession. Most journalists have gone to university, and in politics, many of them have gone to university with the people that are now politicians. We have, even by the time I stopped working in the lobby, we were having to turn copy around much faster, and there was less opportunity to work at making good contacts. And there was much more reliance on the cuttings library, which can't be a good thing. Internet journalism is providing many entry points for journalists, but they're becoming journalists with much less training and more unpaid internships, whether it's a blog or just having something to see in the internet, is much more likely to be taken up by young people who can get parental support and that they don't have to earn a living. So I think it's very difficult to become a journalist now if you don't come from a middle class background. And I think that's a great shame, because we then see our country through a very narrow prism.
Catherine, you mentioned the lobby. Could you just explain to the audience what the lobby is? I think you were chair of the lobby, and explain what kind of privileges members of the lobby have.
I think probably everyone and all the journalists in this call might have been chair in the lobby. The lobby has access to politicians in the rarefied corridors of the Houses of Parliament. It's a club. They work very hard at keeping other journalists out, and it certainly gives you privileged access to your lobby pass. Is worth a great deal, so that you have the freedom to walk down the House of Parliament and bump into MPs or ministers or members of the House of Lords. I think now that they can watch television, watch the House of Commons on their televisions, they're less likely to be walking around the lobby. But Patrick, I'm sure, will be a better position to talk about that than me. So
explain membership of the club. Is there a quota for newspapers? How does it work?
There is a quota. Trevor, you might be able to help me in this. There is a quota. Every paper that pays to have a seat in the lobby will get one pass, or when I was there, we had 4. The bigger papers will have, more. But not everybody on the staff, and the parliamentary staff of a paper is entitled to the lobby. It's usually, I don't know how many, Trevor, how do they work out? How many passes people get?
Last thing I heard, there was about 200 and maybe 250 from various organizations, but a brief history of the lobby. It began, and I don't know exactly when, but I would say about 100 years ago that it was established. And I remember going to the 100th anniversary, which was addressed by Margaret Thatcher, so it tells you roughly how long ago it was. And it started with just about 6 or 8 journalists who were political correspondents, not political editors in those days, who used to have enormous privileged access to everyone they needed to talk to. They would be able to pop in and see the Prime Minister of the day. They wouldn't have to worry about security passes, and they would have their lunches together and exchange information. Then it began to expand to the Sunday newspapers, and then it expanded to regional newspapers, and finally it included all the radio and television. The BBC's probably got 100 lobby correspondents, I don't know. But it's a much bigger, sprawling and less intimate sort of club than it was. It's not as exclusive, and it's very leaky, and basically it's just an accreditation system.
Thank you. Alice, forgive us for keeping you waiting.
Yeah.
You're next. Tell us about the start of your journalism career.
I started 30 years ago, age 21, so quite a long time ago too, I have to say, at the Times as a trainee. And I came in just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is how I got started, really. I'd started off wanting to be a barrister, and then The Guardian, I'd won some award for writing about rent boys in Bristol when I was at university there. And they offered to help pay for me to do a postgrad in journalism. So I just switched, actually, from law to journalism, because I thought I was being paid for, so I might as well do it. So I wasn't really very serious about journalism at the time. And then when the Berlin Wall came down, I gave up, actually, and went off and covered that. And then I did get really totally obsessed by journalism within a very short period when I was in Berlin and then Romania. And it felt really exciting. And I came back and got the job on the Times. And I carried on as a foreign correspondent for a bit. So I did Kosovo when I went out and had to interview the pilots, and actually in a bikini. It was extremely sexist in those days. So I was sent out because I was a woman, I have to say. And then I spent Christmas in Sarajevo. And we were sent.
That sounds rather cold, wearing a bikini.
Yeah, by then I was allowed to wear, like, more layers. But I did all sorts of weird things. Like, I mean, Trevor will know this, but we were sent on the most extraordinary things to do when I was a features writer. I was sent to an S&M party. I was sent to go to a nudist camp. I mean, it was quite bizarre in those days what you do, but we said yes to pretty much everything then. And actually, most of it was really good fun, and you just learned a lot. But I was moved around apartments a lot. And then it was only because they wanted a woman in the Commons that they sent me over to the Commons. And there weren't really very many. Catherine was there, and then Rachel Sylvester came. And in fact, Rachel Sylvester and I were both sent to the House of Lords because he was so junior. She was on the Telegraph and I was on the Times. And that's how we both met, and then started having, you had to have a lunch partner. We ended up being lunch partners together because, actually, partly, I think, because there were so many men, they preferred having lunch together. So Rachel and I got together and we did quite a lot of lunches together. And the House of Lords then was a really good place to learn about politics, because I'd never seen anything like it before. I'd never met a peer. They did all these sort of, they were very old fashioned. A lot of them were hereditaries then. They taught you how to fillet a Dover sole. I'd never heard of gentleman's relish. I mean, it was a really weird place, but actually, what was really good is all these bills were going through and they were amending them. So you started to understand how Parliament worked, which was incredibly important then. You had to have very good shorthand. And then after a year or two, Trevor will probably remember, because I would be far too terrified to have talked to him. We really only talked to the other junior reporters, because there were big teams when I was on the Times there. There were about 10 of us. And we were allowed to do a bit of what was going on. You know, if it wasn't a big debate, you could cover it. But there was a lot of coverage in the Times then of politics, what was going on day to day in the House of Commons, and particularly, you know, in the chamber. So slowly I was allowed to report on the MPs, and then you got to know them a bit better and you started chatting. You got to know a lot of the very junior people in politics, which then was George Osborne, David Cameron. They were all special advisors. So you weren't allowed to go and have lunches with the senior politicians, but you had quite a lot of lunches then. So you got to know them. That's how I really started to get to know Labour and Tory. And it was the Major years at the beginning. So I did, it was kind of interesting because Major was seen as all sort of hot cones and cone lines we had, and sort of, it was all about the Citizens' Charter. It wasn't seen as very serious. It was like we'd missed out on the big politics, which had been the Thatcher era. But it was quite a good ground to learn on. And I spent quite a lot of time there until Charles Moore went to the Telegraph as editor. And then he asked me to go across as the leader writer. And at that stage, I'd always been quite Labour, and I'd been a Labour representative at university. And I remember everyone saying to me, including Peter Riddle, who was my political editor then, who was a sort of huge figure, saying you shouldn't go because it is quite right-wing, the Telegraph. And I turned up and there was Boris Johnson and quite a lot of quite right-wing people, but they were quite entertaining in leader conference, actually. I shared an office with Boris in the end, and they were all highly amusing, entertaining. We had leader conference at 3 o'clock. The leaders had been written by 4. No one took them too seriously. We had Bill Deeds, who'd been there forever, who'd invented Scoop effectively, and was ancient but brilliant. And I helped him quite a lot with it, as sort of almost as his PA. I'd go around with him. And he was like the most eminent person on the paper. And actually, we all had quite a lot of fun. But it was very strange when they then, you know, years later when Boris became Prime Minister, because for me, he is still really just a columnist. And I think with Peppa Pig, he proved he is mainly a columnist. But we had a really great time. And I then did restaurant reviews as well, actually, as doing leaders. And then I started doing a column, which was quite political. When Tony Blair became Prime Minister, it became more political. And I started doing interviews that were political with Rachel Sylvester. We did them together as a double act, as we'd been doing our lunches. So it just continued from there. And we did lots and lots of interviews. And actually, that was fascinating. And you'd get stories from that. But I was never really a proper news journalist after I'd been with the Times as a political correspondent. And I was very much a leader writer and a columnist and restaurant reviewer and interviewer then. And then I went back again to the Times after about 10 years. And there I did the interviews again with Rachel Sylvester. We went back together. And then I did a column, which was not as political, actually, although I knew quite a lot of the people, because people like David Cameron and George Osborne, I'd sort of grown up with really as a journalist. So I had quite good contacts with them. So I did keep up with a lot of them. I just didn't write about it. I wrote about social issues more probably in the end. And I have carried on doing that for about 10 years. And I think journalism has changed. I would agree with Catherine and Trevor that there's not nearly enough local politics now, but also not international. I think we cover, we're very myopic. I think it's interesting having basically a Prime Minister who is a journalist and particularly a columnist. I think that's been very strange. And I'm not sure, I think journalists make the best politicians or prime ministers, actually. But I think others may disagree, but I think you tend to be more flippant, and I think we tend to think, as I would say, columnists, you're thinking on the day what you want, you don't think forwards that far. I think you're always thinking of clever, interesting intros rather than the broader picture quite often. So I think Peppa Pig really was a perfect example of what Boris would have done on the Telegraph. And he would have done that for the first third and then extrapolated, and he would have filed it at 1 minute to 7 and all the subs would have been going completely nuts. And he always filed at 1 minute to 7. So that's really my journey, if you call it that. But I would say actually it's been a lot of fun. I think, I don't think probably politics has changed as much as you think. It goes up and down, but it's always incredibly, I think it's very addictive. I think you just get used to it because it changes every single day, politics. And that's what I like most about it, really.
Alice, you mentioned being a leader writer. That may be another mystery for the audience. So tell us briefly about the daily conference and how many people on a big paper would be helping as leader writers. Who decides what the leader's subjects are going to be and who's going to write them?
So when I was on the Telegraph, I was brought in as the only woman because they were all actually, they were very entertaining, but they were quite argumentative. And I think they thought they didn't really mind what my politics were. It was to sort of calm everyone down. They're quite argumentative leader conferences, as they're supposed to be. The editor doesn't always come up with the ideas, but it's definitely up to him what the line of the leader will be. So when I was on the Telegraph, there were probably 10 of us. The cartoonist normally comes in. They quite like sketching. While it's going on, they get ideas. Occasionally people from the rest of the paper would come, but normally it was just leader writers, and they would go in at 3 o'clock and they would discuss all the different issues of the day and come up with 3 leaders that they thought were interesting, and the editor would choose what he wanted and what the line was. And then we would be sent away to go and write them, and you'd have to write them by about 4 or 5. And the times where I quite often write is go to leader conference only on Mondays and Wednesdays, but that is slightly different. They are at 11:30 and they are taken probably factually more seriously. They're very, you spend a lot of time writing them. They're more dense, they're more, you can't say serious, but there's a lot more probably weight behind them. They worry more about making sure we've always got the correct angle. We take being the paper of record at the Times quite seriously. We'll go back over all the previous leaders we've written. We don't suddenly change our line. And that is always done by the editor. The editor decides what he wants to write and what he thinks. So yesterday we changed the leader. So I was in leader conference yesterday, and we were going to do a leader on how shambolic is Downing Street as the first leader. And then when you had the refugee and the crisis in the Channel and the sort of tragic death of people trying to come across, then I think we decided to change just after lunch and change the leader to that. And then the third leader we did on wet wipes. The third leader is always funny or entertaining or sport, really.
So that might be something else of interest to the audience. How much of the stuff you write never appears because the story has changed or it's spiked for some other reason?
Not much at the Times, actually, or the Telegraph, funnily. I think the Mail's the paper that spikes most, actually. They do a lot of commissioning. But I would say normally they wouldn't have really got going on the leader before we decided to change it. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you have to wait if there's a big speech for the leader to happen, because you can't write the leader until you pretty much know what's going to be in the speech. And sometimes you do, occasionally you do change things very late at night. The columnists never tend to change because they tend to just adapt their columns. But the leaders can be flipped up to about 10 o'clock at night.
Gosh, so late nights sometimes.
Yes, so there's always someone on who will change a column or flip it. And sometimes some editors like writing their own leaders sometimes, but most of the time they don't. Charles more liked doing the headlines for all the leaders, and they would tend to be puns, and he always enjoyed doing that.
Right, now forgive us again for keeping you waiting. Our final speaker is Patrick Wintour, who is now diplomatic correspondent of The Guardian. But Patrick, I think you've been political correspondent or political editor in the recent past. So tell us about your career.
Well, I wasn't going to go into great length about my career, partly because I went to private school in Oxford, and it's very embarrassing to have to admit those errors. But I was a political editor at The Guardian and at The Observer, which is its sister Sunday paper, and I'm now write about international relations. And I partly left because I'd done it for a very long time, and I just thought there was a danger of it becoming quite repetitive, and you need the excitement of coming in each day and thinking this is new, because I had seen some journalists who had sort of suffered from sort of ennui, boredom about everything. Oh dear boy, this is nothing like what happened in the past. And I think you just have to be incredibly excited. But the two things I wanted to mention were really talk about was technology and how that's changed journalism, and then this issue about access to politicians. And just on, neither of these are going to be terribly novel points, but on technology, I just don't think you can underestimate the degree to which our journalistic lives have been transformed. Because like when I started, the assumption was you would be writing 2 or 3 stories and you have them ready by about 6 or 7 that evening, and that was it. There was no requirement to do any more. Once the internet comes, you are, by the end, you're starting at 7 in the morning and not finishing till close on midnight, and you're constantly updating, changing. And I think it became all newspapers became slightly more monochrome and derivative of one another, and also television became more important. The sort of rolling news, Sky and BBC News 24. So I think there's also a kind of technology changes the dynamics between news desks and journalists, partly because news desks know precisely how much something's being read now, where they wouldn't previously have been driving blind, and you could say my incredibly interesting policy story about the Labour Party's really making waves at Westminster, and they would sort of nod and not know anything whether that was true or not. But now they can look for exactly how long an article's, how many people have read an article, for how long they've read it, and all kinds of sort of technology they have now. So they're very much more in control of what they want, and inevitably they lean towards wanting more of something that's working on their website, that's getting more hits than something that isn't. So that changes the dynamic of what between the news desk and the reporter, and it also changes what gets reported. The second thing, which is slightly amorphous, is really about, and I'm maybe out of date, so this is might be wrong now because I left about 4 years ago, but I felt the whole process change, where you did have, by having a lobby pass where you go into this particular area, particularly when there was and you could talk to MPs and go up to them, and there was a sort of general exchange and a sort of understanding that what they told you was off the record, but in some way could be attributed into your newspaper without naming them, but you could be used but not named. And there was this quite a constant contact with politicians, and I think with technology, people having to be by their screen more, changing and updating, not talking directly to politicians, and politicians themselves become much more guarded, and they've now got a phalanx of communications people around them protecting them. General elections, and all the previous speakers know this very well, there used to be morning press conferences with all the political parties, which they'd really get a going over for each day. The panel would be there basically to be hit at by journalists asking them tricky questions. Nowadays, there's none of that. There's a leader's tour, and the leader occasionally gives a sort of soundbite to 1 or 2 news channels, and that's it. And journalists actually now seem to be sort of literally roped off when they go on tour with leaders, and I don't know why journalists have allowed this kind of submissive relationship to develop, where we are very much at their beck and call. We've sort of slightly lost control, and I think as a result there's a kind of there's much more journalism which is not reporting and is much more analytical and propagandizing, because I think there's a kind of breakdown of trust between journalists and politicians that previously existed. I mean, one small example of that would be that maybe 20 years ago, most of the broadsheets, the newspapers would have a full page of actually just reporting what politicians had said in the House of Commons or in the Lords, and there'd be little gobbets of each speech, and there was much more reporting of actually what was happening in Parliament. So there's bills going through Parliament, laws being made, and the process of amendments and changes to those bills were much more regularly reported than they are now. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Patrick, and thanks to all our speakers for getting this off to a flying start. Let me remind the audience that we're going to come to you in 10-15 minutes for your questions. At the moment, so far as I can tell, we have no questions. So please, in the audience, fire questions at our speakers, either at all of them or at any one of them. But we're going to have a panel discussion for about 10 or 15 minutes before we come to the Q&A. And let me kick this off by asking about the response of politicians to the very big changes that you've all described in the press and the practice of journalism during your careers. And perhaps, Catherine, I could start with you, because I think you're the only one who's worked on the other side of the fence when you were press advisor to Alistair Darling in the Treasury. So how did it seem to you when you crossed the divide and became spokesman for a politician? And then we'll come to the other speakers on the panel and ask them about the impact on politics and on politicians and the way that the government media strategy has changed, partly in response to the changes in journalism we've all been talking about. Catherine, do you want to kick off?
Well, for me, it was an incredibly interesting experience. I went into the Treasury in 2007, little knowing what I was going into. The first day that Alistair Darling became Chancellor, Lionel Barber said to him, "Well, this will be a change for you, Alistair. There's no problems in the Treasury." And Alistair agreed with him. As far as using the internet and getting around the system, the traditional system of journalism, Alistair was a very bad example. I mean, he could hardly turn on his computer, far less sort of do any tweeting or blogging or anything else. So he was he wasn't interested in doing that. So he was dependent on me, who handled the politics, and his press office, who dealt with the technical questions about the economy. If I'm going to be absolutely honest, I was shocked when I went into the Treasury. I thought I'd been very well connected with ministers and in different departments, and I had no idea that so many journalists had stories and handed to them in a plate, which at the end of the day, I don't suppose that editors care how they get the story as long as they get them. But what was really, I found sort of shocking, was that if they got them handed to them in a plate, the Treasury only gave them the stories that suited the Treasury to give them. So there was a lot of that. I don't think the Treasury was alone. Beyond that, there were some very, very good journalists who, the Treasury Press Office would sort of be extremely concerned, and if they were getting sort of calls from different journalists, but there was a lot of putting out what the Treasury wanted to put out, which was very surprising to me. I thought there was much more a much more inquisitorial relationship between sort of important members of the lobby and the Treasury press team.
Was that partly the result of Alistair Campbell's strategy? I was going to ask you all about what were the big turning points during the course of your careers in the relationship between politics and the press. And my sense, looking at it from outside, was that when Alistair Campbell came in as Tony Blair's chief press spokesman, he was shocked that Whitehall wasn't planning every day what the main news stories were going to be, and his strategy seemed to be to saturate the press with government stories in order to try to dominate every day the news agenda, as it were, for the government every day to get onto the front foot, so as not to be too defensive. Is that a correct reading? Trevor, let me come to you next. Was that a turning point in 1997?
Absolutely. I think that everything changed with the advent of both New Labour and particularly with Alistair Campbell, who, of course, had been a lobby correspondent himself. He was political editor of the Daily Mirror. And he admitted, Alistair made no bones about the fact that he didn't see himself as a journalist anyway. He saw himself as a propagandist, and that was his own description. And he knew how the system worked simply because he'd worked in it from the outside and knew where he thought the weaknesses of it lay. In those days, the government information offices were all public servants who simply took the sort of career paths. They joined as juniors and gradually worked their ways up to head of press, and often may have had political leanings one way or the other, but by and large, they did their best to conceal them. But basically, they are bureaucrats. They weren't activists. And what Alistair wanted, and in fact got, was a complete shake-up of the government information service, so that people who worked assiduously to push the Labour Party line, as opposed to the government line or the public sector relationship with departmental relationship with government policy. And this was a very systematic and thorough operation, which completely revolutionized Whitehall and the relationship between the machinery of government and the journalism, the political journalists. And I remember two occasions actually. One journalist who went to work for a government office, in fact, in the Prime Minister's department, said it was like moving from one side of a one-way mirror to the other, so that you could see what was going on. You'd throw out an idea or a hint or a story or something and see how it felt, how they reacted. And if you didn't like it or they didn't like it, you would say that's all pure speculation. But you could watch the feeding frenzy from inside and see how it spilled out. And another example, for instance, a guy who worked for the Belfast Telegraph, who had been covering the Northern Ireland beat for his entire journalistic career, after about 20 years was recruited by the Northern Ireland office and went in and came home afterwards and was saying he had no idea what was going on during those 20 or 30 years that he had been working as a reporter. He was only looking at what was allowed to be seen by the department, by the politicians, by the ministers. And it wasn't until he actually joined the department that the scales fell from his eyes. So that gives you a glimpse of just how much control the politicians and the departments have over the flow of news, the way it's picked up, the way it's dealt with, the way they react to it, except on the odd occasion when we manage to prise open a sort of gap in the carapace and find something they don't want. And frankly, that is the essence of political journalism. It is finding stories that the politicians and the government or the opposition do not want in the papers. And otherwise, it's all PR, it's all advertising, as they say.
I'm going to come next to Alice and to Patrick and ask you if you could also to tell us a little bit about whether the government sometimes practices favoritism by offering exclusive to certain papers, and also the reverse. Famously, the Johnson government for a while had a ban on ministers appearing on Radio 4's Today programme. So tell us a little bit about that as well. But over to you now to talk about the impact on politics and politicians of the changes during your life in the press.
I would say that just from the interview point of view, when we started out doing interviews, I would say that Number 10 were actually quite good at giving Rachel Sylvester and I interviews, and you could haggle a bit. And but you've got a lot of the senior politicians who would be quite prepared to sit down and do an interview, and they would know nothing about beforehand what you were going to say, how you were going to say it. And it was done in quite a straightforward way. And I would say that became harder and harder, actually. They wanted to control these interviews much more. They were less likely to do an interview. They were furious if they thought that you were trying to trip them up in any way. And then it ends up now, I think, with Nadine Dorries, who just says, you know, I don't do press. She doesn't give interviews at all. And I think that is sad. I think that you need to be able to explain your policies. And I think this idea that Boris Johnson has it a lot, and, you know, he is himself a journalist, but he doesn't like journalists interviewing anyone really in his cabinet particularly, partly because I'm not sure if he thinks that some of them are up to being interviewed, but you know, some of them used to really enjoy it. I mean, Peter Mandelson loved being interviewed, and actually George Osborne did too, because they almost saw it as a game. It was like, you know, okay, test me. And I think that's what it should be like. I think it should be quite independent, and I think you should be prepared to have any question thrown at you. And I think it's the same on the Today programme, or I think you need to have, and you've got some very big beasts in television that should be allowed to question what these politicians are doing.
Patrick, what would you like to add? Could you unmute?
I was just going to agree with Trevor about just the mirror thing. I spoke to a journalist who went to work in Number 10 under the Labour government, and I just asked him, you know, how much of what's going on in reality do we find out? And he said, you get about 20% of the real stories that are happening inside government at any one point, which is surprising because there are so many journalists. It's so competitive. We're all on top of each other, and you think more would come out than it does. So I think government is quite effective at keeping what it wants from public glare.
Let me just ask,
sure.
Can you cultivate relationships with officials as opposed to politicians to try and find out more of what's happening on the inside?
Yes, of course you can, but they are very wary of, I mean, where I work at the moment, I mean, my main patch might be, say, for instance, the Foreign Office. And there's this whole cadre of ambassadors who, in theory, should be very available and used to be quite available. But in the last 2 to 3 years, they've been told that they shouldn't talk to journalists, which is ridiculous because they're so, you know, well skilled at talking and know so much and can put the British case on so many issues. But it's a very, very siphoned and structured form of news currently at the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office news department used to be run by diplomats, and it's now largely run by people who are news professionals. I'm not saying it's wrong or right, but it's changed that. And then the other point that Trevor said, which I thought was right, that I think Alistair did change the quality of the sort of news operation. And it wasn't that there weren't other people previously, such as Bernard Ingham or people who worked for John Major, who were good. But I think what Alistair did was he professionalised the whole of Whitehall. So government departments became much more sort of news orientated, and they had the grid telling them each week what they wanted to do. And then you have this development of the special advisor, one of whom would be policy orientated and the other would be media orientated, and almost their sole job was to make sure that their Secretary of State was getting decent media or that its relations were working well within Whitehall. So those were the big changes. I mean, it didn't always work. I mean, Alistair would, you know, the first 2 or 3 years of the Blair government, there were sort of loads of disasters and things that they didn't want to happen. Many ministers resigned. There was the Eccleston affair. So it's not like you can control the world. It's just not possible. So I just we're going back to this initial point which I was trying to make, is I do think the access to politicians and politicians' availability has changed, and it was striking that someone who's really, really good at interviewing, apart from Alice and Rachel, is Andrew Neil. And basically he could only get sort of minor members of the SNP to interview, because no one else dared to be interviewed by him, because he'd be too effective, and he'd be effective on the left and on the right, although I'm sure he is on the right. You would not know that from the quality of his interviewing. But as a result, politicians became scared and thought, well, what's in this for me? And they decided they didn't have any democratic duty to make themselves answerable to Andrew Neil or to anyone, and so they simply didn't do interviews. And I don't think actually Boris Johnson does very many interviews, and when he does, he actually makes an idiot of himself, which is partly why he doesn't do them, because he doesn't focus and work out what he wants to say. When you're doing an interview, a politician should, particularly a TV interview, should know the 2 or 3 things they want to get over, and he often doesn't know.
I think it's also worth saying that the coverage in Parliament is very narrow, and it's, I think Patrick's point was very valid about the number of hits, each story gets. If there was more journalists able to spend more time in select committees and different parliamentary committees, like Alice and Rachel would have done when they were young journalists in the Lords, I think people would be much wiser, and we would know much more about the actual mechanism of Parliament. But after everyone is after the sort of sexy headline and then the greatest number of hits, and actually we miss out on a lot because there's no staff to cover these committees.
But
I think that's the equivalent today of the loss of the local newspapers. This is the nitty-gritty of political life, which we're not taking any notice of anymore. And one of the things that Alistair Campbell developed, and other governments have followed since, is the thing called the line to take. So a politician, a minister, or a public servant or a spokesman will know that they can say, in response to a particular question, they can say this, but they've got several other cards ready. If under pressure, they're asked a further question which demands an answer, they can lay another card on the table, and they don't show the pack, of course, so you don't know that they've got more information ready to tell you if you really press hard. And if you don't press, you simply get the first card, which might be no comment. The further you press, the more you learn. And one of the great pleasures I found as a political journalist was having lunch with ministers who would come along with the line to take, and you would ask them a question about the story of the day and they would give the answer. You knew it wasn't the full answer and you'd press a little bit. And if you got to know them well enough, the line to take didn't last very long, and very swiftly you found them actually telling you the story you knew was there. And this is where personal relationships come into this game. It's the fact that people learn to trust you, that you develop a sort of a communication, a dialogue, and you know what to ask, how the answer might come if you put it the right way without forcing them into a corner, leaving them enough room to escape. And that really, it's like fishing. You have to know where to throw your hook.
Now it's time, I think, to come to the audience and their questions. And let me just tell people that Alice Thomson has to leave us very soon after 7. So if there are any questions specifically to Alice, Abby, could we put those in the first round? We'll take questions, I think, in groups of 2 or 3. So Abby, would you like to select the first 2 or 3 questions?
Yeah, sure. So I will go to Denny, Leslie, and Tim.
And panel, you don't have to answer all 3 questions, all of you. You can choose. Denny. Could you unmute? Yes.
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I'm Denny Fensham. I'm a lecturer in European politics at UCL. And a lot of my own work has been on media and migration coverage in particular. And I was just interested in the opinion of all panelists about how ideas of racism in terms of media coverage have changed throughout your careers. That's my question, really. Thank you very much.
Very good. Hold that if you would, panel. And I think next we were going to Tim. Or Leslie. Whichever of you speaks first.
Hello, it's Leslie here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I wanted to ask the panel about the use of the COVID briefing system, not about the COVID briefings, but recently last week they had a briefing where the Prime Minister came on, and it seemed to be the day that the bomb had gone off in Liverpool, outside the hospital. And then they kind of told us nothing about COVID. And I just wondered what the panel's view is of that pre-prepared daily kind of briefing, whether you think that would potentially enhance accountability because people can be questioned, or whether it actually harms accountability because people do have those pre-prepared lines to take that you've just described.
Thank you. And finally, Tim.
I wondered whether newspapers were less likely these days to have columnists whose political slant was rather different from the parent newspaper. So would i.e. the Telegraph having maybe some left-wing columnists, or the Guardian having some right-wing ones. If that's the case, do you think it's unhealthy that this means that the readers of particular newspapers are getting a much narrower slant on issues than maybe they did in the past?
Thank you. So Alice, I'm going to come to you first because I know you need to slip away. Then we'll go to Trevor, then Catherine, and then Patrick. And as I said, you don't have to answer all three questions, all of you, just the ones that you fancy. Alice.
I can go through them quickly. So racism, I think, comes and goes in newspapers, and I think it quite often depends who's in power. And I would say, having reported a lot on different refugee crises, I think the papers can be quite responsible at times and very moving, but they take time to get going. So I would say, if you look at it now, when we had yesterday the awful events in the Channel, they covered those very well. Newsnight last night I thought was exceptionally good and very balanced, but they can stir things up far too much at the beginning. I don't think we did get the facts out actually at the beginning of this crisis about how many refugees are trying to get to Britain, how many migrants are trying to come over. And you need to have the facts there too. So I would always say with any of those issues, you must put in all the facts. And we need to know what the balance is. So I would say that, just as a specific point, on COVID, I don't actually particularly like the briefings. I thought the problem with the COVID briefings is that I covered COVID more actually than I covered Brexit. And I think we missed some stories. We were obsessed by the daily briefings, and things like care homes just got missed. So I think if we hadn't had that, as many of those, we probably would have gone looking for our own stories more. And I think there were a lot of stories out there, particularly human interest stories that had happened during COVID, that we took too long to get to, and we should have been more on top of. And on columnists, I would say, yeah, I think you need to have a really broad range if you can. I like it if on the Guardian you feel that you're being challenged both ways. I think the same with the Times. I think when we're too myopic and too centrist, or too polemical in one direction, it doesn't work. I think what people want to do is be challenged as much as anything else. I don't think there's any point in reading a column that you think yes, yes, yes. I think actually I'm just as happy if someone reads a column and goes, totally disagree with that, that's appalling, that's not me. But at least it's defining your opinion. So that's what you want in a newspaper. You want them to encourage you to think. And I think you want a column to be a column, and I think you want news not to opine. So I very much think that's another important issue for newspapers, is to keep those both apart very much.
Thank you. Abby's just sent a reminder to the audience. Keep your questions coming in the Q&A function. Trevor, over to you.
On the question of columnists, I think that nearly all newspapers do have a variety of views, political and social. We certainly do. We have, for instance, people know pretty well where I'm coming from, but they never know where Rod Liddle, for instance, is coming from. And there are a lot of other columnists, including Jeremy Clarkson and many others, who write regularly and are often quite contrarian, considering the position of the Sun over the years. And I think you need that. You need a bit of colour and texture and contrarianism. On the issue of racism, I think that the debate on racism is comparatively new, in the sense that it's become very intense, and almost everything now is viewed through the prism of race and identity politics. So in a sense, everything we write now is with the thought of the implications for the debate on racism in the back of our minds. And as a result, to some extent, we walk on eggshells. in order not to invoke the antagonism, for instance, of the Stop the Hate campaign. They are an incredibly powerful group of people who could stop a newspaper in its tracks and basically destroy it or seriously damage it. So we are constantly thinking and avoiding any pitfalls that might come in our path. And I think in any event, the issue of race itself has taken on a more thoughtful dimension. People, I think, are looking at the whole area of racial issues and tolerance and understanding in a way which perhaps 2 or 3 years ago they would not. And finally, on the SAGE and COVID press conferences, I think, except in the early days when they were very important, they became extremely tedious and repetitive, and often were forums for, particularly the broadcasters, to get their particular quotes on air without really probing or developing a storyline that might have been growing through the course of the press conference. And I think, they took up an awful lot of time. I think they were basically a wasted opportunity too.
Thank you. Catherine.
Well, I agree largely with what Alice and Trevor have said. I mean, when I was talking about the sort of domination of the middle class at the beginning, I should also have mentioned, and I think it's interesting, here we are, 4 white people talking about journalism, that I think racism or coverage is a problem. And certainly in political journalism, we have far too few people that are from ethnic minorities covering it. And we have far too few women. And I think these are the 3 big negatives about journalism, and there's 3 that should be corrected. I'm not sure if we had a different ethnic mix in the political lobby, would the coverage be different? But I hope so. And certainly when there's been more women, and Alice and Rachel were very important in this, certainly there were issues covered in the Times that would not have been covered if it had been left to the men. And it was a problem when I was there, and it's still a problem.
Patrick?
Can't really improve on what Catherine said about race. Our newsroom is still far too white, and I know the executives do spend a lot of time thinking, how do we broaden it? But the result is still not good enough, and often they're not in senior enough positions. And I think if you look at American newspapers, they're way ahead of where we are. And the lobby in particular is, it was a very white domain. And just very briefly on migration, I just think the way it's covered is, it has often been totally racist, and I think one of the big reasons the referendum went the way it did was because there were so many newspapers just pumping out stuff about migration, which is such a sort of toxic issue, and they conveyed the threat there were going to be hordes of Turks coming over the borders if we stayed in the European Union, and parcels of lies. So there we are. That's my view on that. And on COVID, I think they were. I think the problem with them, there was no concentrated questioning. So it would be one question on this subject, another on another, and it often works best when someone prizes open an opening point from a politician, and then the second journalist comes in and then pursues it some further, and then a third journalist comes in and pursues it even more. It's a bit like the way Trevor was describing his lunch. You've got to be fishing, but you need to be fishing collectively sometimes, or just to get the one story out of the press conference. And they also dotted in sort of just general members of the public to say, is there anything that the Prime Minister would like to tell a grateful nation, just to sort of fill up the space. So that was a problem. And then on newspapers, diversity, yes, I mean, we have Owen Jones writing for us. We have stacks of sort of elderly male white centrists, and we have Simon Jenkins, who's supposed to be the voice of the contrarian conservative right. I mean, I don't like contrarian journalism for its own sake. It's got to be the quality of it, but it's absolutely essential every newspaper challenges its readership.
Very good. So I think collaborative journalism may come up in the next set of questions. We've got 4 in the Q&A. Let's take them, Abby, if we may, in 2 groups of 2, and quick answers from the panel, please. And Alice, we know you have to slip away soon, so feel free to just quietly slip away when you have to. Abby, 2
Great.
questions, please.
Perfect. I'll come to Leslie James and Claude Green, and you should both be able to speak.
Thank you very much. We've been hearing quite a lot this evening about concerns about subservience of journalists to politicians, but equally we were hearing not so long ago about the fear of politicians of being what's called monstering in the press. How do these 2 forces balance out, and how much can we rely on what we're actually reading?
Thank you. And Claude?
Yes, following up, in fact, on the point Patrick Wintour made about the scope for competing journalists to perhaps occasionally cooperate together to hold governments more tightly to account.
Thank you. So quick answers, panel, please. Alice, if you have time, would you like to go first before you have to disappear?
I would say collaborative journalism is great. I think that's the way to do it quite often. And I think it did happen a lot with the political editors. I mean, Trevor will say more, but I think they did get together quite often. And you also had your lunching partners when you were in Westminster, and you would break stories together. And I have always worked quite a lot with Rachel Sylvester, and that's not particularly common in journalism that 2 people work together, but I've actually really enjoyed it. I like working with someone else. And I would say that you don't want to seem like you're hounding someone or going in a pack. But I do think it's important, as Patrick said, you need to have a line of attack that you then keep following you look at each other's questions, you try and find new angles, you're trying to work out what is going on. Because as I said, we often don't know more than about 20% of it. So you do need to operate together often, I would say. And the second question I have now actually forgotten.
The second one was about collaborative journalism. The first question was about subservience, if that gives you a...
Yes, I would say that politicians are always going to say that they have a rough ride and it's really tough and it's really difficult. But I think actually they get a pretty easy ride most of the time. And I think that we should often be tougher. I think we are actually quite deferential sometimes. And we do let them get away with quite a lot at the beginning. I would say if you look at Gordon Brown, he was pretty dysfunctional as a prime minister from the beginning, and we let him get away with it for quite a bit of time before we actually hit back as the press. And I would say Boris Johnson's had the same, that he has really been quite, Downing Street has been quite messy, quite, I would say, unprofessional, and you're allowed to get away with it. You get the benefit of the doubt for a bit if you're a prime minister, and then the press turns. But I think that actually there is a reason for that, that actually I think journalists pay quite well in that way.
Trevor.
On the question of subservience, I don't think that is entirely an accurate description. I don't think it's an accurate description at all, really. I think that most journalists want to get a story. They don't want to be following a line, otherwise you might as well just take a press release. If you get told, one of the things that Alistair Campbell used to love to do was to feed out the following day's press release early. So you get it 24 hours early and there'll be a scoop, an exclusive. But it wasn't really a scoop or an exclusive because you'd been hand-fed. And then the next day, the same story would come out as a press release, and then everyone else would write it. And so you'd sometimes get 3 goes at one story. And I think that was a challenge to us as journalists to go in a different direction. And it was an extremely agreeable sensation when you did and succeeded in unearthing stories that really they did not want to see in print. And they were valid stories. These weren't mischief making. They weren't just people, a shark feeding frenzy. These were stories which were valid in their own right. And if they were not particularly obliging to the government of the day, then they would upset that government, obviously, and all governments, not just Labour or whatever. So, and this was the challenge that we had to go through. But the more you did unearth stories that they didn't want in the paper, the more respect you gained from them. One of my colleagues, now deceased, told me in my early years with the lobby in Westminster that if you kick them in the balls, they'll come back to you because they need you more than you need them. And this was a rather brutal sort of description, but it was true. And the more you revealed that you could actually take them on at their own game, and bearing in mind how much they knew that you didn't, and also how skillful politicians have become in recent decades in public relations, in buttering up journalists, feeding them these tidbits and making them perhaps dependent in some cases. It's quite a challenge to take that sort of different line, and I think it's very rewarding when you do. As for the question on collaborative journalism, well, this is somehow part of the same thing. If you're in a press conference and you're asking questions about something you know has lots more mileage in it than they're prepared to yield, and you ask a question and nobody else follows you, you have to keep asking until someone realizes that there's a story here and that they should pile in too. And after a while, their curiosity becomes pricked. And it's, again, a great pleasure to see, for instance, in the case of Alistair, who was very bluff and very brutal sometimes in his handling of some of the journalists if he didn't like them very much. There was one particular one whose life he made a terrible misery of. But once you're onto a story, once you're on the scent of a story, if you keep probing, the collaboration comes in almost automatically because others sniff the scent and want to get in on it, on the act.
Now we're coming into our last 5 minutes. And so forgive me, I'm going to ask Abby just to squeeze in 2 more questions, the last 2. And Catherine and Patrick, if you had something additional to say about subservience or collaborative journalism, fit it in your answers to this final round. So Abby, could we have the last 2 questions, please?
Yeah, perfect. I'll go to Leslie Stephen, who should be able to speak.
Hi, thank you. How does the panel think journalists could earn the trust of public servants, civil servants and so on, and encourage them to be open with the press? I just wonder if public servants could perhaps be cultivated in a similar way to, you talked about cultivating politicians so that you can get the inside story, or whether it's all seen as too career limiting and it's not possible to protect whistleblowers, so it's not an avenue to pursue.
Thank you. And the last question, please.
And then Halima asked, do you think that the journalist's alignment with a particular ideology further strains the relationship between politicians and their willingness to give an interview to a journalist who they believe comes from the opposing side?
Okay, so I'm going to go Catherine and then Patrick, and then the last word to Trevor. Quick answers if you would, please, because we have only 3 or 4 minutes left. Catherine.
I think quite a lot of particularly specialist journalists do have good relationships with public servants. I think public servants should don't really be there to, to tell them about policy. It's not, they shouldn't be political, but they should be helped to keep them as informed as possible. And I think that sometimes helps. I remember when I went into the Treasury, when they were doing an oil story, the Treasury was always very concerned that they gave the help the Financial Times and the Aberdeen Press and Journal, because they said that the correspondent in the lobby for the Aberdeen Press and Journal knew as much about oil as anybody else in the country. So I'm sure officials would have spoken to the oil correspondents. And but I think that is different from whistleblowing. I think that you can't sort of, if a public servant wants to whistleblow, that's a completely different thing from a public servant trying to help a journalist write informed copy. And the second one, what was that question? What was the second question? God.
Can anyone help us? Sorry,
yes,
my mind's gone a blank too.
I think that's inevitable. I think that if somebody, I mean, politicians sometimes, you know, it's a completely wrong perception that they're always saying that somebody's biased or unbiased, or that they're not as nice to them as they should be. I think the good politicians will speak to anybody, and the politicians that are weaker won't. And I don't know if that's going to change. I mean, certainly our view in the Treasury was, when Alistair was there, he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, he was the second most important politician in the land, and there should be no journalist that he was afraid to talk to. So he talked to as many as possible.
Patrick.
Just on the interviews thing, I mean, say on the eve of the Conservative conference, the top 2 or 3 people, the Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary, would all be parcelled out for interviews to the right-wing press, and then journals like myself, the Guardian, would probably end up with the sort of Culture Secretary, although it wouldn't now, that wouldn't now happen because it's Nadine Dorris. But anyway, it would be that kind of distribution of, and then it would work vice versa for Labour. So we would end up with the interview with the Labour leader, and maybe the Daily Mail would not end up with an interview at all. So that's the way it works. And there's a perception that it's safer for them to operate in that way. And however much you try to persuade people, actually, you can interview by us. You won't be stitched up. That's not what the head of the press operation will ever think. There we are. If you end up with a personal relationship with the cabinet minister and he insists they will do an interview with you, even though you're working on the other side of the fence. So for some strange reason, I used to get on quite well with Ian Duncan Smith, and he would do interviews with me, you know, which was mainly annoyed the Guardian readership because I always thought I was too kind to him.
Trevor, you have the last word.
Right. Well, I mean, the main thing is, and Patrick and Catherine have both touched on this, it's a matter of relationships. It doesn't matter who these people are that you're talking to, whether they're politicians or civil servants or bureaucrats. They're human beings, they're not robots. And if you have some sort of dialogue, they love gossip. I mean, that's one of the reasons they get involved in politics, particularly. They all want gossip. And sometimes you can tell them gossip that they didn't know about, and they love it, especially if it's about one of their colleagues. And then, of course, they unwind and start telling you things. And interestingly, the question that asked about politicians not talking to people from an opposite viewpoint, some of my very best stories have come from people on the Labour Party, in the Labour Party, from cabinet ministers and from Labour Party staff. So it crosses all borders, and this is why political journalism is so fascinating.
It is now 7:15. I'm sorry, we must now wrap it up. Before I thank tonight's speakers, let me just quickly give the trailer for next week's seminar. It's the Good Law Project, which has brought a very successful test case litigation against the government. And the speakers are its founder, Joe Morm, QC, and their legal director, Gemma Abbott. And there is the slide telling you about next week's seminar. But finally, let me thank all of tonight's speakers for a really fascinating discussion. We've learned lots of tricks of your trade, you seasoned journalists, and we've covered lots of ground. So thank you, all of you. Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Alice, who's had to leave. And Abby, could we have a drum roll, please? Thank you very much.